She had 6 shots, 8 men in front of her. Colton looked at the revolver in her hands and smiled the smile of a man who has already done his arithmetic. "You are one woman," he said. "This doesn't end the way you think it ends." She raised the gun, both hands, sights aligned, breathing out. "The first two of you," she said, "are going to have a very specific problem." She fired. This is the story of how Eliza Ward arrived in Wyoming territory in a black wedding dress sold by her own father to settle a gambling debt, and what happened to every person who made the mistake of believing she could be owned. The Union Pacific screamed into Millhaven Station at 2:30 in the afternoon, 3 hours late, trailing black smoke that hung in the still September air like something that had given up trying to move. The engine shuddered to a stop with a long, exhausted groan, as though the machine itself understood that what it carried deserved more dignity than it was about to receive. Eliza Ward pressed her forehead against the hot glass of the passenger car window and watched the platform materialize through the coal haze. 40 people, maybe more, standing in the kind of patient, curious clusters that only form when a town has been told something unusual is arriving. She had not expected so many. She had not expected any warmth from them either, and she was not disappointed. Her carpet bag sat heavy on her lap. Everything she owned in the world fit inside it. 2 dresses, both faded to the color of things that had once been something else. A hairbrush with half its bristles gone. Her mother's wedding ring on a chain she wore under her collar, where no one could see it, where no one could add it to the long list of things already taken from her. And buried at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, and hidden beneath a false lining she had sewn herself the night before she boarded the train in Boston, the papers. The contract. The document that had made her, in the eyes of the law and in the calculations of one desperate man who called himself her father, something that could be transferred from one pair of hands to another like a promissory note or a parcel of land. The train lurched once more, then settled. Steam hissed in long white curtains on both sides of the car. Metal groaned somewhere deep in the body of the locomotive. Eliza lifted her head from the glass. She had been on this train for 4 days. 4 days of watching America change outside the window. The dense brick of Boston giving way to rolling green, then flat brown, then the vast amber emptiness of land that went on so long it stopped feeling like land and started feeling like a condition. 4 days of sleeping upright because she could not afford a sleeping berth. 4 days of eating what she had packed herself because she could not afford the dining car. 4 days of rehearsing in the careful and private theater of her own mind every possible version of what came next. None of the versions she had rehearsed looked anything like what was actually waiting for her. She stood, straightened her spine until it was as close to vertical as her exhaustion allowed, lifted her chin, picked up the carpet bag. She would not let them see her break before they had even started breaking her. She walked down the aisle of the passenger car with her shoulders back and her eyes forward, past the other travelers who had already begun collecting their things, past the conductor who held the door without looking at her, and she stepped down onto the platform. 40 pairs of eyes turned as one body. She felt them before she saw them fully, the way you feel weather before it arrives. A kind of pressure, a collective intake of breath that was not quite a sound but registered somewhere in the chest all the same. And she understood in that moment what they were looking at. Not the carpet bag, not the travel-stained boots, not the exhaustion that she had taken great care to wear as composure. They were looking at the dress, the wedding dress. Black as a crow's wing, black as a winter sky with no stars left in it, black as the kind of decision that cannot be unmade. She had been wearing it for 4 days. She had boarded the train in Boston wearing it. She had slept in it and eaten in it and watched the country change outside the window in it, and she intended to arrive in it because a woman named Eliza Ward had decided in the hours after her father disappeared and left only a contract and a note of apology on the kitchen table that if she was going to be delivered somewhere like a piece of goods, she would at least arrive in the color that told the truth about it. Her father had bought the dress. He had presented it to her 2 days before signing her name on a labor indenture contract that sold 5 years of her life to a rancher in Wyoming territory named Silas Crawford to settle gambling debts that had grown to the size of a small catastrophe. Edward Ward had called the dress a gift. He had said it with the particular tenderness of a man who understood he was doing something unforgivable and wanted very much for the tenderness to serve as a kind of down payment on forgiveness. She had kept the dress. She had altered her interpretation of it. If they wanted to deliver her like something being buried, she would wear the appropriate color. A woman near the far end of the platform laughed, short and sharp like a branch snapping. The woman beside her turned to look and then quickly looked away, which was its own kind of commentary. A man in a gray suit pushed through the crowd, thin, spectacled, carrying a leather portfolio under one arm, with the careful grip of someone who understood that the contents were more important than he was. He stopped 3 feet from Eliza and consulted a paper from inside the portfolio without making eye contact. Miss Ward, not a question. Yes, she said. I'm Amos Fletcher, attorney at law. I represent the estate of the late Silas Crawford. The word late arrived in her consciousness like a stone dropped into still water. She watched the ring spread outward from it. Late, meaning past tense, meaning no longer present in the world in the way that living people are present. He's dead, she said, passed 9 days ago. Fletcher's voice carried no inflection of condolence or apology. This was business, and he was performing it. Stroke, very sudden. His affairs are being settled according to his will. The crowd was murmuring now. She could feel the texture of their interest shifting, sharpening. They had come expecting one kind of transaction and were now receiving a different, more interesting one. Eliza stood very still on the platform with her carpet bag in both hands and worked through the logic of it. The man who had purchased her contract was dead. The document that had made her property was still valid because paper does not die when the person who signs it does. It transfers, it reverts, it finds new hands. What happens to the contract? She asked. Fletcher adjusted his spectacles. The contract is a legal instrument attached to the estate. It transfers to the designated heir, or failing that reverts to the primary creditor. In this case, that is the Millhaven Commercial Bank. He paused as though giving her time to absorb the architecture of her situation before the next load was placed on it. The bank is currently represented by its owner. He glanced toward the crowd. A woman stepped forward from the edge of the gathering, and the space around her changed in a way that Eliza noticed immediately. Not dramatically, not like a theater entrance with lighting and music. Quietly, the way water changes shape around a rock without the rock doing anything at all. Harriet Stone was 52 years old and looked like someone had long ago decided that softness was a structural weakness and had engineered accordingly. She was tall, rigidly corseted, her silver hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to be performing a kind of permanent flinch. She carried a parasol she did not open, as though she had brought it to establish the possibility of shade without having any particular interest in shade itself. She moved through the crowd, and the crowd moved for her, not because she asked them to, because they already knew what happened to things that did not move. She stopped 6 feet from Eliza and looked at her the way you look at a piece of livestock you are considering purchasing, but suspect might have a problem with one of its legs. The black dress registered in Harriet Stone's eyes and produced no visible reaction. Whatever she thought of it, she had already decided it was not going to change her plans. "You're younger than the photographs suggested," Harriet said. "I was not aware photographs were part of the arrangement." They weren't. Something passed across Harriet's face that was organized like a smile but felt nothing like one. Silas was thorough in his business dealings. As am I. She turned to Fletcher with the efficiency of a woman who had already moved past this part of the conversation in her internal calendar. "Read the relevant portion of the will, Mr. Fletcher." Fletcher cleared his throat and found the correct page. "In the matter of the labor indenture contract held on behalf of one Eliza Ward, the contract shall transfer to any responsible party willing to assume the debt of $848 within 24 hours of my death, said sum, representing the original purchase price of $800 plus accumulated interest. Failing such assumption, the contract reverts to the Millhaven Commercial Bank as primary creditor." He looked up. "Do you have the means to pay this sum and void the contract yourself, Miss Ward?" "No, Bob." She said it simply without shame because shame was a luxury she could not currently afford. "You know I don't." "Then you remain bound." He closed his portfolio. "Mrs. Stone holds the right of assumption on behalf of the bank, or we may offer it to any interested party present at the stated sum." He raised his voice to address the crowd. "Is there anyone present willing to assume this contract for $848? Silence descended on the platform like weather. Eliza looked at her feet, at the grain of the boards under her boots. She counted the spaces between the planks. She breathed slowly and without sound in through her nose and out through her mouth, and she did not allow her hands to shake, though they very much wanted to. Behind her and around her, she could feel the calculations happening. She was not imagining it. She had been in rooms where she was being calculated before. She knew what it felt like. The particular quality of silence that is not really silence at all, but a great deal of noise happening inside a great many heads. Someone in the back of the crowd said something about what kind of work she was suited for. Someone else closer said something about her appearance that she did not choose to register fully. Harriet Stone's voice cut through it all with the precision of something well-maintained. "I'll offer 600, cash today." Fletcher frowned. "The contract specifies 848, Mrs. Stone. For damaged goods." Harriet's tone was the temperature of iron left in shade. "The woman arrives alone, unchaperoned, after traveling across half the country unescorted. Her reputation is compromised at best. 600 is generous." Eliza felt the heat rise from somewhere below her sternum, felt it move up through her chest and into her jaw, felt her hands tighten on the handles of her carpet bag until the leather bit into her palms. She stared at the boards and she breathed, and she did not speak because she had nothing to say that would help her and everything to say that would make things worse, and she had learned the hard way that those two categories are rarely the same. Then a voice came from the edge of the crowd. It was not loud. It did not need to be loud. It had the quality of certain voices that do not require volume because their particular register carries an authority that volume only cheapens. Deep, level, carrying an edge that made the nearest people instinctively take a half step to the side. "She's not damaged." A pause, the crowd began shifting. "She's a person, not livestock." Eliza lifted her head. The crowd was parting. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with that particular deference that bodies give to something they have unconsciously assessed as requiring passage. A man was walking through the gap, moving toward the space between her and Harriet Stone with the deliberate, unhurried pace of someone who has already decided what they are going to do and is simply covering the physical distance required to do it. He was tall, well over 6 feet, lean in the way of men who have worked hard their entire adult lives and eaten what was available rather than what was preferred. His face was weathered in the specific way of men who have spent years looking at things they would rather not have seen. The lines around his eyes and mouth were not laugh lines. They were something else, something older and less comfortable than laughter. His hair was dark going gray at the temples with the kind of silver that arrives not from age but from a certain quality of burden. He wore range clothes that had collected the honest dust of a long ride, trousers, boots, a work shirt, the color of a clear sky that had been through weather, and over it, a brown leather vest worn soft from use, the kind of garment that has become a second skin rather than a covering. He was not wearing a gun. She noticed this immediately and filed it without knowing yet why it mattered. His eyes found hers for a fraction of a second before moving to Fletcher. They were pale blue, almost gray, the color of ice at the edge of a winter river. And in them, in that brief quarter second before he looked away, she saw something she had not expected to see in a stranger's face on a railroad platform in a town she had never been to. She recognized it because she saw it every morning in her own reflection. Guilt. Not the surface variety, not the kind that sits on the face like a weather condition and passes when the sun comes back. The deep kind. The bone-deep variety that has moved in permanently and rearranged the furniture. He stopped next to Fletcher and reached into the inside pocket of his vest without preamble. "What's the sum again?" $848, Fletcher said, and something shifted in his professional neutrality. Not surprise exactly, something more careful than surprise. "Mr. Calloway, I didn't expect to see you in town." "Reed Calloway," the man said with a slight, careful emphasis on the first word as though he was reminding someone of something. "The full name." He drew out a leather wallet worn thin with use and began counting bills onto the leather surface of Fletcher's portfolio. Hundreds, 50s, 20s. His hands were steady. Absolutely steady the way the hands of certain people are steady, not because nothing troubles them, but because they have long since arrived at a place where trembling would be beside the point. 800, 820, 840, 848. He pushed the stack toward Fletcher. "That cover it." The crowd had gone completely silent now. The quality of it was different from the earlier silence. This one had texture. It was paying close attention. Harriet Stone had not moved. She was holding her parasol with both hands, and the knuckles had gone white, which was the only evidence that anything happening in front of her was not fully within her control. She was looking at Reed Calloway with an expression that Eliza would later understand was not anger. It was something more patient than anger. It was the expression of someone who was being made to revise a timeline rather than abandon a plan. Reed Calloway, Harriet said, and her voice had dropped to a register that carried better than shouting. You have no business interfering in this matter. He did not look at her. He watched Fletcher count the bills. Technically, Fletcher said slowly, running his thumb across the edges of the bills with the concentration of a man who understands he is about to make a decision that will inconvenience someone powerful and is trying to find a procedural reason not to. If the sum is paid in full within the specified window, the contract transfers immediately to the paying party. That is what the will stipulates. Then it's legal, Reed said. A man paying a legal debt within the term set by the deceased, nothing irregular about it. Fletcher gathered the bills. His hands were not as steady as Reed Calloway's. Harriet Stone let 3 full seconds pass before she spoke again, which Eliza would also later understand was a strategy. The 3-second pause was not hesitation. It was a demonstration of control. Look how little hurry I am in. Look how little you have changed my day. This is unconscionable, she said. You're taking advantage of a desperate situation for your own purposes. I'm paying a legal debt. Reed finally looked at her. Just look the way you look at something you have already assessed and found to be exactly what you expected. What you were planning to do with that contract was also legal. I'm aware of that. He let a brief quiet interval pass. That's between you and your conscience, Mrs. Stone, if you have one. It was not said with malice. It was not said with anger. It was said the way a man states a fact about the weather, and somehow that was worse than either malice or anger because it suggested that his opinion of her had been formed in advance through evidence and was not subject to revision. Harriet turned on her heel. The crowd separated for her the same way it had when she entered, and she moved through it without looking at anyone, and then she was gone, and whatever space she left behind did not feel like relief. It felt like something that had been interrupted rather than resolved. The crowd began to break apart. The performance was over. Or maybe, as Eliza would think later, it was only just beginning. It entirely depended on where you were standing. Fletcher extended his portfolio and a pen. Mr. Calloway, your signature transferring the contract, and Miss Ward, your signature acknowledging the transfer of your service obligation. Eliza looked at the man who had just purchased her indenture with nearly $900 of his own money on a train platform in Wyoming Territory. This man she had never met, never spoken to, never exchanged so much as a telegram with this stranger with ice-colored eyes and a brown leather vest and hands that did not shake. I don't understand, she said. Why would you do this? He picked up the pen Fletcher was holding out and signed the paper without looking at her, slid it across for her to sign. We'll discuss it at the ranch. That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting right now. He nodded at her carpet bag. That everything you brought, she looked at the boom, at the entirety of her material existence in the world. Yes, then, let's go. He started walking. She stood for a moment on the platform with the paper in front of her. Fletcher waited. A few people lingered at the edges of the dispersing crowd, watching with the particular attention of people who expect something more to happen. She signed her name, Eliza Ward. The letters looked the same as they always had, neat and careful, the handwriting of a woman who had spent 8 years teaching children their letters in a Boston schoolroom, who had believed that literacy was a kind of freedom and had not yet fully reckoned with all the ways that belief could be insufficient. She picked up her bag and followed Reed Calloway through the thinning crowd, past the whispers and the stares, out through the station's wooden overhang, to where a buckboard wagon waited in the shade with a dun-colored horse standing drowsily in the traces. Reed lifted her bag from her hands without asking and set it in the wagon bed. He offered his hand to help her up onto the seat. She looked at it for a second. A working man's hand brought across the palm with rope-scarred fingers and calluses built from years of doing things that needed doing. She took it. His grip was brief and firm, and he released her the moment she was settled, with the deliberateness of a man who had considered the gesture carefully in advance. He climbed up on the other side. The wagon rolled forward. The town fell away behind them. The prairie opened ahead, vast and gold, under the September sun, and Eliza Ward sat in the wagon with her carpet bag between her feet and watched Wyoming territory unspool before her, and thought about nothing in particular, which was the way her mind had learned to protect itself from thinking about too many particular things at once. They rode in silence for the first mile, then the second, then the third. The horse's ears moved back and forth, tracking sounds she couldn't hear. A hawk circled somewhere high up, patient and unhurried, riding a thermal, with the authority of something that has never been required to explain itself. At the 3-mile marker, a wooden post half-eaten by weather, she could not stand it anymore. "Why?" she said. He kept his eyes on the road. Why did you do that? Pay nearly $900 for someone you don't know?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he had decided not to answer. Then something shifted in the set of his shoulders, some small internal rearrangement, and he began. "5 years ago, I was a deputy U.S. Marshal out of Cheyenne." His voice was level and uninflected, the voice of a man giving a report rather than a confession. "My last assignment was tracking a gang that had killed 4 people in a bank robbery outside of Laramie. We caught up to them eventually. There was a shooting. I killed 3 of them." He stopped. The wagon moved over a rut in the road and they both shifted with it without thinking. "The 4th surrendered. My partner and I brought him in. Everything by the book. Legal, clean. And," she said, "2 months later, I found out one of the men I killed wasn't part of the gang." He said it the way you say things that have already been said in your head too many times to have any of their surface edges left. He was a Pinkerton agent working undercover. His name was Daniel Foster. He had a family, a wife, 2 children, and I put a bullet through his chest in a ravine outside Laramie because in the smoke, in the confusion and the bad light, I thought he was a criminal. The word criminal hung in the air between them for a moment. A hawk somewhere called once and then was silent. "It was ruled justified," Reed continued. "Line of duty, no charges filed. But his family didn't accept that. They hired investigators. And those investigators found evidence that complicated the picture. Evidence that made it look less like a mistake and more like something deliberate." She looked at his profile. The japa, the line of his mouth, the way he was watching the road as though it required careful navigation, though the road was straight and clear. "Were you in on it?" she asked. "What they said you did?" He was quiet for 3 full seconds. "No," he said. "I was a marshal doing his job. But there are things about how it happened that I cannot explain clearly enough to satisfy everyone, including myself." She absorbed this. "You resigned." "I resigned, came back here. This ranch belonged to my wife's family." A pause, brief and heavy. "She died 6 years ago, diphtheria. It took our son too, Thomas. He was 6 years old." The prairie said nothing. It was very good at that. "I've been alone here since," Reed said, "working the land, staying out of the way of most things. Trying to determine whether a man can make something useful out of what he has left, when what he has left is mostly regret." He looked at her then directly for the first time since they had left the platform. Those pale eyes steady and without apology. "I saw you standing on that platform with the whole town looking at you like you were a transaction waiting to be completed. And I saw a woman who had arrived in a black wedding dress standing with her back straight and her chin up, not begging, not crying, just waiting to see who would come to claim her. Like you had already calculated how to survive whoever it was." She said nothing. "I was standing there thinking about how I had spent 5 years looking for something I could do that might count for something decent. And I saw you, and I thought this counts." He looked back at the road. "Maybe it doesn't fix anything. Maybe it's just a man trying to buy his way back into feeling like a human being. But it's done now." The wagon rolled on. The prairie stretched in every direction without apology or limit. After a long while, she said, "What do you want from me in return?" He reached into the inside pocket of his vest and produced a folded paper, which he held out to her. She took it without touching his hand. She unfolded it, looked down at the neat, careful handwriting. It was a contract. Handwritten, clearly considered, every clause measured twice before being set down. 5 years of domestic labor, separate living quarters, a salary of $20 monthly after the first year held in trust, no physical contact without explicit consent. The contract voidable by either party in the event of any violation of its terms. She read to the bottom where the final clause was written in slightly different ink as though it had been added separately after the rest in a different frame of mind. Upon the completion of 5 years or upon mutual agreement to dissolve this contract at any earlier point, Eliza Ward shall receive full deed to 100 acres of Callaway Ranch land, free and clear of any encumbrance, as compensation for services rendered and in recognition of her inherent human dignity, which is not diminished by any legal instrument that is claimed otherwise. She read it twice, then a third time. She looked up at him. This isn't a contract for servitude. No, he said. This is a contract for partnership. If you'll sign it. She thought about this for a long time with the wind moving through the tall grass on either side of the road and the horses' hooves keeping their steady rhythm against the packed earth. She thought about her father's note on the kitchen table. She thought about the contract she had arrived with, the one in the oilcloth at the bottom of her bag, the one that described her in terms a livestock auctioneer would recognize. She thought about the Millhaven platform and 40 pairs of eyes in Harriet Stone's parasol and the particular quality of contempt that wears the face of practicality. I'll sign it, she said finally, but understand that I'm signing it because it serves my interests, not because I'm grateful, not because I trust you. He glanced at her. That's fair. Trust is earned. I know that, he said. I haven't earned anything yet. The ranch appeared over the next rise, and it was larger than she had expected. A main house 2 stories weathered but sound, with a wide porch facing the afternoon light. A smaller cabin set back about 50 yards to one side, its door painted a blue that had faded to gray. Corrals of barn fields that had been worked hard, but not recently. In the distance, barely visible at the edge of the property's eastern boundary, 3 small mounds of earth with wooden markers. She looked at the markers. He noticed. My family, he said, without she needing to ask. Grace, Thomas. A pause. The third one has no body under it. That's the grave I dug for Daniel Foster. He's buried in Denver, but it seemed right to have a place for him here where I have to look at it every day, where I have to account for it. She looked at the 3 mounds and felt something move through her that had no clean name. Not pity exactly, not sadness exactly. Something more like recognition. A man who had built his own monument to his own guilt and lived next to it every morning. Reed brought the wagon to a stop in front of the small cabin and climbed down. He lifted her carpet bag from the bed and set it on the cabin's porch with care. Then he opened the door and stood back. She went inside. The cabin was small, one room 12 feet by 12 feet perhaps. A narrow bed with a cornhusk mattress and a wool blanket that had been washed recently. She could smell the soap in it. A table with knife marks and water rings, 2 chairs, a pot-bellied stove in the corner. A window facing east, its glass intact. The floor had been swept recently, the broom marks still faint in the dust. He had cleaned it. Before she arrived, he had cleaned it. She turned. He was standing in the doorway, not entering. He held out 2 things. The first was a key on a short chain. Only key to this lock, he said. No copy. The second was a package wrapped in oilcloth, which she unwrapped to find a short-barreled revolver well-oiled and working order. You know how to use one of these? No, she said. I'll teach you tomorrow. If anyone comes to this cabin that you don't recognize, anyone who makes you feel uncertain, you use it. That's what it's for. She looked at the gun in her hands, the weight of it, the particular quality of an object whose purpose is irreversible. You're arming the person whose contract you own, she said. I'm giving tools to a partner, he said. There's a difference. He stepped back from the doorway. Supper in an hour. It won't be remarkable. He walked away toward the barn leading the horse. She watched him go from the doorway of her cabin. The brown leather vest, the blue shirt, the particular way he moved through the space around him, as though he was perpetually carrying something that was not visible and was heavier than it looked. She closed the door, found the lock, turned the key. She stood in the center of the cabin alone with the key in one hand and the gun in the other, and let the silence of Wyoming territory settle around her. Then she set both things on the table, sat down on the edge of the bed, and began with the careful efficiency of someone who has long since learned not to waste movement, to unpack what little she had brought into a space that was for the first time in 4 months her own. Supper was beans, not well seasoned, bread that had been good 2 days ago. Coffee so dense and dark it required a certain kind of commitment. Reed set 2 bowls on the table in the main house, and they sat across from each other in the lamplight and ate without much conversation. And Eliza noted that the silence between them was not uncomfortable in the way that silence often is between strangers. It was simply silence, two people sharing a table, and the particular kind of quiet that neither of them had much use for filling. She noticed other things, the photographs on the mantel above the fireplace thick with dust she had not yet touched. A woman with dark hair and a quality of warmth that came through even in the silver gelatin record of an old portrait. A small boy, 5 or 6 years old, grinning at the camera with an expression of absolute uncomplicated joy that does not survive childhood in most people and must therefore be recorded when it exists. And Reed Calloway, in the photograph younger by a decade at least, standing with his arm around the woman and his hand on the boy's shoulder, smiling, actually smiling. She looked away. It felt like intruding on a wound. After the meal, Reed washed the dishes himself. She watched his back as he stood at the basin by the stove, the way he scrubbed each bowl with the focused energy of a man attempting to clean something that is not quite the bowl. She had seen that kind of washing before, the kind that has nothing to do with dishes. "There's a man looking for me," he said without turning. His voice was level, like a man reading from a document he has already memorized. "His name is James Foster. He's Daniel's younger brother. He was a sharpshooter during the war Confederate side, which means he knows how to be patient and how to be accurate. He's been looking for me for 5 years." She set her fork down. "He found out I was in Wyoming," Reed continued. "I received word from a contact in Cheyenne 3 days ago. James Foster has crossed into the territory. And you'll do what when he comes?" "I won't run. Will you fight him?" He was quiet for a moment, drying the first bowl with a cloth. "No." "Then you'll let him kill you." He did not answer. She sat with this, with the implications of it, with the full architecture of what she was looking at across this kitchen table in this ranch house in the middle of Wyoming territory. A man who had bought her contract, given her a key and a weapon, and a cabin with a locked door, written her a partnership agreement that promised her land and dignity and a future. A man who was by his own quiet admission and lack of denial planning to die. "There's a journal," she said. "Daniel Foster's journal, you told me." He turned slightly. He had not told her about the journal, not explicitly. She had seen the shape of it in the way he had spoken about evidence and the impossibility of certain kinds of proof. "You found something on him," she said, "after. Something that showed what he was." Reed set the cloth down. He turned all the way around and looked at her across the kitchen. "There is a journal," he said. "It was on his body when I found him. His personal record of everything he had done, every piece of information he sold to the gang, every death that resulted from what he told them. The 4 people who died in that bank robbery died because Daniel Foster had given the gang the exact time the payroll would be there and the exact schedule the guards would follow." "Then it proves you were right. It proves he was dirty. It doesn't prove I didn't know that before I killed him. It doesn't prove I gave him a real chance to surrender." His jaw tightened, "And I took it from a dead man with no witnesses. Any lawyer would argue I fabricated it. Any jury would wonder. Also, you've carried it for 5 years. I've carried it. And you have not given it to the people who might be helped by it." He looked at her without answering, which was itself an answer. She folded her hands on the table and thought about James Foster crossing into Wyoming territory, patient as a man who has decided that waiting is simply a form of purpose. She thought about the journal buried somewhere in this house or this barn or this life, a document that might not save Reed Calloway in a court of law, but might do something entirely different, in the hands of a man who wanted above everything else to understand what had actually happened to his brother. "Give it to him," she said. Reed went still. Not to a court, not to a lawyer, to James Foster directly. Let him read it. She met his eyes, those pale winter water eyes, and did not look away. "He came here wanting the truth. That's what he told you. A man who only wanted revenge would not say that. A man who only wanted revenge would not announce himself. He would simply act. He could destroy it. He could, but a man who spent 5 years looking for the truth about what happened to his brother and who crossed an entire territory to find the person he believed responsible, and who then stood on your porch and said he wanted the truth rather than simply pulling a weapon and using it. She paused. I think that man, if you hand him proof that his brother was what you've been saying he was, will find that the thing he has been carrying is heavier than the anger and will have to put one of them down. Reed looked at her for a long time. The lamplight moved between them and the draft from the half-open window. That's a considerable risk, he said finally. So was paying $900 for a stranger on a train platform, she said. And yet here we are. She stood, collected her plate and cup, placed them by the basin. Good night, Mr. Calloway. She walked back across the 50 yards of dark ground between the main house and her cabin, unlocked her door, went inside. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the locked door and the key in her hand and the wrapped revolver on the table, and she thought about everything that had happened since she stepped off a Union Pacific train in a black wedding dress 3 hours earlier, and how none of it had resembled any version of it she had rehearsed. After a long time, she lay down without undressing and looked at the ceiling and listened to the particular quality of silence that belongs to a large empty country at night. No city sounds, no neighbors, no sound at all, except the wind in the dry grass and very faint from somewhere far away, and high up the sound of something calling out to something that did not answer. She was almost asleep when she heard it, from the direction of the main house, soft enough that she almost assigned it to the wind or a trick of distance. But she knew the sound, had heard it before in other circumstances, in other rooms, in the specific acoustic privacy that people seek when they believe no one can hear them. Reed Calloway was weeping, not loudly, not dramatically. The low, controlled, barely audible weeping of a man who has been holding something at arm's length for a very long time and has run out of arm. A sound like something tearing slowly rather than all at once, the way certain things give way after too much has been asked of them for too long. She lay still and listened to it until it stopped. The light in the upstairs window of the main house burned for another hour after that. She could see it through the east window of her cabin, a small yellow rectangle in the dark shape of the house, unmoving and persistent. She thought about the photographs on the mantel, the woman with the warm eyes, the boy running through a field somewhere that she could not see, caught in the silver gelatin record of a moment of pure joy preserved exactly as it was on the day that everything that followed had not yet happened. She thought about what it costs a person to build a grave for someone who is buried somewhere else, to plant a marker in the ground of your own property and look at it every morning while you figure out whether you are the kind of person who deserves to still be standing. She thought about the contract in her bag, her father's contract buried in the oilcloth, and the new contract, the one Reed Calloway had written by hand and offered to her on the road, the one that described her not as property or obligation, but as a person with inherent dignity that no legal instrument had the authority to reduce. She thought about the black wedding dress she was still wearing, which had started as her father's idea of an apology and had somewhere in the last 4 days become something else, something she was not quite ready to name yet. The light in the upstairs window burned on. Outside, the stars of Wyoming Territory filled the sky in the particular profusion that is only possible very far from any city, from any source of light that is not the stars themselves, a sky so dense with them that the darkness between them seems almost incidental, almost beside the point. She watched the light until her eyes closed. She slept. The second morning arrived without ceremony. Eliza was awake before the sun cleared the eastern ridge, sitting at the small table in her cabin, with her hands around a cup of water she had drawn from the barrel outside the door, watching the gray light strengthen through her east-facing window. She had slept better than she had any right to expect. Better than she had slept in 4 months, which was a fact she filed away without examining too closely, because some things are better understood at a distance. She changed into the second of her 2 dresses, folded the black one, with the same care she would give to something that had served her well under difficult conditions, and placed it on the shelf above the bed. She was not done with it. She simply was not wearing it today. Reed was already in the yard when she came out, standing by the fence post nearest the barn, with a cup of coffee in one hand and his eyes on the horizon to the north. He did not hear her approach, or if he did not acknowledge it, and she stood beside him for a moment looking at what he was looking at, which appeared to be nothing in particular. The horizon was clean, blue and gold where the sun was beginning to press against it, wide enough to make a person feel either liberated or terrified, depending on what they had left behind. "Coffee's on the stove," he said without turning. "I'll get some after." "After what?" "After you teach me to shoot properly." He turned his head then and looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of approval, which differed from most people's version in that it contained no warmth whatsoever, only a kind of neutral acknowledgement that the data had arrived in a useful form. They went to the open ground behind the barn where he had set up a line of empty bottles on the fence rail. 6 bottles. Dark glass old whiskey labels still half adhered to some of them. The morning light caught them and made them glow amber and green. He showed her the revolver again. How to hold it with both hands because the single hand grip you saw in illustrations was mostly decorative. How to align the sights without tensing the arms. How to breathe out before the trigger. Not held but released because the body moves when it holds breath. And movement is the enemy of accuracy. The first shot went wild and high. The recoil surprised her even though she had expected it, the way certain things surprise you even when you are fully prepared for them. "Again," he said. The second shot clipped the top of the third bottle. Glass rained down on the fence rail. Again. The third shot took the fourth bottle cleanly. It fell straight down without drama the way things fall when they are hit properly. Something happened in her chest. Not triumph exactly. Closer to reclamation. A small door opening in a part of herself that had been sealed for a long time. "Again," he said, and there was something almost imperceptibly different in his voice this time. Not warmer, just more present. She fired until the cylinder was empty. 4 of 6 bottles down. Her right hand ached from the grip, and her ears rang in a way that seemed to change the quality of the morning, making it both quieter and sharper at the same time. She lowered the gun and looked at the 2 surviving bottles. Then she became aware of a stillness in Reed that was different from his ordinary stillness. She turned. He was not looking at the bottles. He was looking at the ridge to the north at the same point on the horizon he had been watching with his coffee. There was a figure up there, on horseback, motionless. The distance made it difficult to determine much except that it was a single rider and the horse was dark and neither of them were moving. Just sitting there at the top of the ridge looking down at the ranch the way a hawk looks down at open ground with the patience of something that does not need to hurry because it already knows the outcome. She looked at Reed. He watched the ridge for 5 more seconds, then turned back to the bottles as though the figure had not been there. "Reload, Hayom," he said. "Left thumb on the cylinder release." She reloaded. She did not ask about the rider. She was learning that some information Reed Calloway would give her when he decided she needed it, and that pressing before that point produced nothing useful. It was a quality she recognized from dealing with difficult private people in the Boston schoolroom, the ones who shut down the moment they felt pushed and opened only when they felt ready. She fired again. 5 of 6 this time. They walked back to the house in silence, the morning fully established around them, now the ranch coming to life in its quiet, practical way. When they were inside and she was washing her hands at the basin, she heard the wagon wheels of the delivery cart on the road and thought nothing of it. She heard Reed greet the young driver at the door. She heard the sound of crates being set down on the porch. Then silence, and after the silence, the sound of the cart moving away. She dried her hands and went to help bring the supplies in. She lifted the first sack of flour and felt immediately that it was wrong. Too heavy. Not the soft, yielding weight of flour, but something harder underneath, something that moved differently when she shifted it. She set it down and opened the neck of the sack. Flour on top, perhaps 2 inches deep. Beneath it, stones. Smooth creek stones, a dozen of them, each the size of a fist. She opened the coffee. Same arrangement, a layer of grounds over a layer of gravel. She unwrapped the salt pork and found good meat on the outside and meat that had gone bad at the center, the sourness of it hitting her sinuses like a warning. Reed came out onto the porch and she showed him. He looked at what she had laid out on the rail. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. His jaw shifted once the only indication that anything he was seeing was registering as anything other than expected information. No sender on the invoice. Nothing, just Calloway Ranch as the destination. He looked at the creek stones in the flour sack. He picked one up and turned it over in his hand. Set it down. "She's telling me she can reach anything I have," he said quietly. anytime she wants, and I won't know until it's already inside the house. Eliza looked at the stones, at the careful theater of it. The trouble someone had gone to the specific, deliberate quality of the message. This was not vandalism. Vandalism was impulsive. This was considered. She knew exactly what she was doing, Eliza said. She wanted you to think about it, to imagine every supply line, every delivery, every person who comes into this property, to feel the edges of what she can touch. Yes. Then she's patient. Eliza set the bad meat back in its wrapping, more patient than her offer at the station suggested. She didn't expect to lose at the station. She had to adjust. He looked at the horizon to the north, though the rider was long gone from the ridge. Harriet Stone has been adjusting for 30 years. She's very good at it. She had not known until that moment that he knew anything specific about Harriet Stone's history. She waited. He was quiet for the length of time it takes a cloud shadow to cross a field. 3 years ago, he said, a family named Harding ran a good-sized cattle operation 12 miles south of here. They had a barn that could hold 200 head through the winter, an honest operation built over 20 years. He set another stone down on the rail. The barn burned, middle of February, when losing a barn is a different kind of problem than it is in summer. They couldn't recover from it. They sold inside 6 months. To whom? The bank, which at that time was becoming Harriet Stone's bank. Another stone. 2 years ago, a family named Colburn held the grazing rights on the East Mesa. Best grass in the county in a dry year, which most years are. Their herd disappeared over the course of 3 weeks. 40 head, just gone one or two at a time, in ways that looked like bad luck, a fence gap here, a spook drive there. By the end, they couldn't make the note on their property. And they sold. They sold. And now they work the land that used to be theirs for wages that Harriet Stone pays on terms that Harriet Stone sets. He picked up the last stone and held it for a moment, then set it down. Hutchins told me this when I came back to the territory. He wanted me to understand what I had come back to. Eliza looked out across the ranch, at the fences, at the barn, at the 3 grave markers in the far distance, small vertical lines against the horizontal land. She needs the water rights, she said. That's what this is about, not the money you represent, the water. The aquifer under this property feeds 6 ranches in the valley. If you control the water in Wyoming territory, you control everything that grows, everything that drinks, everything that grazes, everything that lives. He turned from the railing. There is a railroad survey being conducted. The territorial office has been quiet about it, but certain people know. If a rail line comes through this valley, the land values change entirely, and whoever controls the water controls the negotiation. She thought about Harriet Stone's expression at the platform, the calculation in it, the patience. She thought about how the woman had offered $600 for a human being and called it generous and meant it not with cruelty, but with the sincere efficiency of a person who has organized the world into assets and liabilities and genuinely cannot locate the category that moral objection belongs to. When will she move? Eliza asked. She already has, he said, and gestured at the stones on the railing. This is moving. This is the first note in a piece of music she has played before. It ends if she runs true to form with fire. He carried the ruined supplies to the burn pile at the back of the property, and Eliza watched him go, and then she went inside and began making the inventory of what was actually in the pantry and what could actually be used, which was less than she had hoped, but more than nothing. And she thought about Harriet Stone in her bank office, and what a woman like that thought about at the end of the working day, when the accounts were settled and the ledgers closed, and the only remaining business was deciding what tomorrow should accomplish. That evening, she found the trunk. Reed had gone to check the south fence line before dark, and she was cleaning the main house, which needed it badly with the focused energy of someone who understands that putting order into a disordered space is sometimes the only form of control available. She swept and scrubbed and organized the shelves that had been left in the particular entropy of a man living alone for 6 years without much interest in surface appearances. In the back of the storage room off the kitchen, under a canvas that had been folded carefully once and then used as a surface for tools and not refolded, she found a cedar trunk. The initials burned into the lid were GC, which she understood immediately. Grace Calloway. She did not open it. She stood with her hand resting on the lid for a moment, the cedar smell coming up through the canvas she had lifted, and she thought about what it means to keep something like this. To have it here in this house covered and preserved and not open for 6 years. She covered it again with the canvas, placed the tools back as she had found them, and went on cleaning. But when she came to the mantle and the photograph, she stopped. She looked at Grace Calloway's face for a long time. The dark hair, the warmth in the eyes, the particular kind of beauty that is not primarily about features, but about the specific quality of attention a person gives the world. The way the camera had caught it, that quality preserved in silver on paper. She looked at Thomas, the grinning boy, the outstretched arms. She looked at Reed in the photograph, the younger version, the one with the smile that meant something different than what his face meant now. She set the photograph down carefully, exactly as she had found it, and finished the cleaning. At supper, which she had cooked herself from what the pantry actually contained, she told him about the trunk. Not that she had found it, but that she had seen the GC on the lid through a gap in the canvas and had not disturbed it, and was asking now whether there was anything in the storage room he preferred she not touch. He looked at his plate, then at her. "Nothing in the storage room," he said. "Everything else in the house is fair access if you need it for the work." "The trunk is hers." "Yes. I won't touch it." He nodded. She had the sense that the conversation was important to him in a way he would not say directly, that her acknowledgement of the boundary had registered as something significant. "She would have liked you," he said without looking up from his plate. The sentence arrived in the room and settled there, heavy and delicate at the same time. She did not answer it. Some things require no response and are only diminished by one. He washed the dishes. She dried. They worked together in the kitchen in the lamplight with a silence between them that had developed in 2 days, a texture different from what it had on the first night. Not comfortable exactly. Not uncomfortable. Present. She was about to take her lamp and go back to the cabin when he said without any particular preparation, "Tell me about Boston." She paused. "Why, Baise? Because I've been talking for 2 days and you've been mostly listening, and that's not a conversation, that's a deposition." She sat back down at the table. He poured 2 cups of the terrible coffee and set one in front of her and sat across from her in the lamplight. She thought about Boston, about the schoolroom in the Beacon Hill district, where she had taught reading and arithmetic and basic composition to 30 children, at a time children from the families of dock workers and seamstresses and small tradespeople who wanted more for their children than they had had themselves. She thought about 8 years of that work, the satisfaction of it, the specific and irreplaceable pleasure of watching a child suddenly understand a thing they had not understood before. She told him some of it, not all of it, but the shape of it, the life she had had before her father's gambling became a catastrophe, before the note on the kitchen table, before the contract that had made her a line item in someone else's ledger. He listened the way he did everything, without unnecessary movement or comment, with the focused attention of a man for whom listening is itself a form of action. When she finished, he said, "You'll teach again." Not a question, a statement of a thing he considered settled. "I don't know what I'll do," she said honestly. "I know," he said, "but you'll teach again." She went back to her cabin and lay down on the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling. Outside, the Wyoming night pressed against the window. Somewhere beyond the North Ridge, James Foster was in the territory and moving closer, and somewhere in the town of Millhaven, Harriet Stone was adjusting her timeline, and somewhere in the barn, or the house, or this very building, a journal written in a dead man's hand was either a solution or another version of the same wound. She did not sleep for a long time. On the 7th night they came. She heard the horses first. Multiple animals, not the sound of 1 or 2 passing through, but the grouped, purposeful sound of a party moving in formation, not troubling to disguise the sound, because they had decided that the sound itself was part of the message. She was up and dressed before the sound fully resolved itself. The revolver was in her hand before she was fully awake, the motion of taking it from the table, having bypassed whatever part of consciousness normally supervises such decisions. She went across the dark ground between the cabin and the main house at a run, not bothering with the lamp moving by the starlight and the shape of the ground she had memorized over 7 days of crossing it. She did not knock. She went straight in. Reed was already standing in the main room, dressed, his rifle across his forearms. He looked at her when she came in and at the revolver in her hand and said nothing, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. They stood together at the front window. 5 riders in the yard, 5 horses, lanterns on 2 of the saddles throwing light in moving ovals across the ground. The man at the front dismounted. He moved with the deliberate economy of someone who had spent a long time learning how to be precise, how to eliminate the unnecessary from motion and intention both. He was perhaps 50 years old, broad through the chest and shoulders, with a face that had been weathered to something close to stone by whatever combination of war and grief and sustained purpose had been applied to it over decades. He came to the porch steps and stopped. He did not come up onto the porch itself. "Reed Calloway," he said. His voice was not loud. It was exact. The voice of a man who has learned that precision is more effective than volume. "James Foster," Reed said. The name settled into the air between them. Eliza stood to Reed's left, the revolver loose at her side, not raised, not holstered, somewhere in the deliberate middle ground that says, "I know what I have, and I know what I'll do with it, and I'm giving you the opportunity to not require me to decide." James Foster's eyes moved to her. They were dark, deep-set, and whatever emotion lived in them at depth was so thoroughly managed that only traces of it reached the surface. He took in the revolver. The posture. The plain, straight-spine quality of her presence in a situation that most people would have found reasons to remove themselves from. He looked at Reed again. "You know why I'm here?" "I know. I have a warrant." He reached into his coat with the deliberate, visible slowness of a man demonstrating that his hand is going to a document rather than a weapon. He produced the paper. "Criminal homicide, issued by the federal court in Denver. It's legal." "I'm not disputing the warrant," Reed said. "Then you'll come with me." "I'll come with you to Denver for a proper hearing, not under arrest in irons. I'll ride under my own power and present myself to the court." A pause. "If that's acceptable." James Foster looked at him for a long time. The lantern light moved across the yard between them. "You're not running," James said. It was not quite a question. "No. You've had 5 years to run." "I know." The man at the front of the riders held the warrant and looked at Reed Calloway, and something worked behind his face that was not visible in any specific feature, but was present in the whole of it, the way weather is present in the whole of the sky before it arrives anywhere particular. "I want to understand what happened," James Foster said, and his voice dropped half a register on it, just enough that the change was audible in the quiet air. "Not what the report says, what actually happened." "I know," Reed said again. "That's why I came myself. I could have sent men." "I know that too." Eliza spoke then. She had not planned to speak. The words arrived without the usual consultation with the part of her that assessed risk and consequence. They simply came because she had been looking at James Foster's face for 3 minutes, and she had seen what lived behind the stone of it. "Mr. Foster," she said. He looked at her. "You came because you want the truth," she said. "Not a conviction, not a hanging. The truth of what your brother was and what happened to him, and whether the man standing next to me is what the records make him look like or something more complicated." She let a brief pause settle. "That's why you said what you said just now about understanding." James Foster looked at her with an expression that was briefly unguarded, the expression of a person who has been accurately described by a stranger and has not yet decided how they feel about the accuracy of it. "Who are you?" he said. "Eliza Ward. I arrived here a week ago." "You're the woman from the platform." "Yes." He looked from her to Reed and back. Something in the calculation behind his eyes shifted, reconfigured around a variable he had not been including. "There's a journal," Eliza said. "Reed has it. He's been keeping it for 5 years because he didn't believe he could use it without it looking like he'd manufactured it. But he can give it to you. Not as evidence in court, as the truth directly from your brother's hand." She held his gaze. "If you want it." The yard was very quiet. The horses breathed and shifted. The lanterns swung. James Foster was still for a long time. "Bring the document," he said finally. "Not tonight," Reed said. "I need a day to consider the right way to do this." A pause. James evaluated. "You have until tomorrow night." He looked at Eliza again with something that was not quite respect and not quite its absence, but was something that acknowledged the specific gravity of what she had just done. Then he turned and mounted his horse, and led the 5 riders back out of the yard and into the darkness. She stood on the porch after the sound of the hooves had faded and thought about what she had just committed Reed Calloway to. He was standing behind her, and she could feel the quality of his stillness, which was different from his usual stillness. "You made a considerable decision on my behalf," he said quietly. "Yes." Without asking. There wasn't time to convene a meeting. A long pause. "You're right about what he wants," Reed said finally. "I've been watching a man who wants revenge for 5 years, and James Foster is not that man. He's a man who wants to stop not knowing. Those are different problems." "Yeah," she said, "they are." She turned and went back to her cabin. She did not sleep. In the morning, Reed went to the barn and she did not follow. She knew from the particular quality of his absence that he needed the time alone with whatever the journal contained and whatever he was going to decide to do about it. She had given him the direction. The walking was his. She cleaned the cabin. She worked in the kitchen garden, which had been neglected but was not unsalvageable, pulling weeds from around the potato hills and the dried bean rows with the focused physical satisfaction of work that produces visible results. The sun moved across the sky. A meadowlark said something into the morning that no one answered. At midday, Reed came out of the barn and told her he was going to Millhaven. She waited. "Harding is a friend," he said. "He has information I need about the water claims. And I want to speak to Fletcher about the legal standing of Harriet's petition before she moves it formally to the council." "How long will you be gone?" "Overnight. Back by tomorrow evening." She thought about the rider on the ridge, the stones in the flour sack. Tomorrow night. "I'll be all right," she said before he could say it. He looked at her for a moment, then went to the barn and saddled his horse, and she watched him ride out through the front gate and onto the road toward town, the brown vest catching the noon light, the line of his back straight and unhurried. She spent the afternoon methodically securing what could be secured. She had been thinking about it since the stones in the flour sack. She moved through both buildings with the practical architectural attention of a woman who has taught children in rooms where the fire was always the central safety concern, thinking about sight lines and entry points, and the specific geometry of being somewhere alone when people who wish you harm decide to arrive. She had 6 shots. This was a fact. She organized the rest of her thinking around it. She boarded the lower windows of the cabin with boards from the woodpile, angling them so that what was inside was not visible from outside, but she could still see through the gaps. She moved the extra blankets and the water barrel inside the main house. She found in the barn a length of heavy chain that she used to brace the barn door from inside, testing its resistance to force. Her hands hurt by sundown. She made a meal from what was in the pantry and ate it standing at the kitchen window, watching the road to town and the ridge to the north in equal proportion. At dusk, Jake Colton rode into the yard. She recognized the type before she knew the name. A man who has been employed for specific purposes by people who do not wish to be visible in the execution of those purposes. Not stupid, not impulsive. Precise in the way that hired precision is precise, which is to say calibrated to the minimum amount of force necessary, and no more, because unnecessary force draws attention, and attention is the enemy of this kind of work. He had 3 men with him. They did not dismount. Colton pulled up 20 feet from the porch where she was standing and looked at her the way you look at something you have already assessed and found to be manageable. "Mrs. Stone sends her regards," he said. She said nothing. "The quitclaim document needs to be signed by noon tomorrow. Transfers the water rights to the bank as settlement of the existing debt." "There is no existing debt that encumbers the water rights." His expression did not change. "Mrs. Stone has documentation suggesting otherwise." "Mrs. Stone's documentation was written in the wrong ink for the date it claims," Eliza said. "I'm a former school teacher. I know ink. That document is a fabrication." Colton looked at her for 3 full seconds. Then he looked at the house behind her and the yard in the barn. "Mr. Calloway seems to be away." "Mr. Calloway's location is his own business." "Of course." He shifted in his saddle. "Mrs. Stone hopes he'll see reason when he returns. She's a patient woman. But patience has limits." He held her gaze with the practiced ease of a man who has delivered this kind of message many times and knows exactly how long to let the silence after it sit before pulling the reins. "She asked me to make sure you understood that clearly." "I understand Mrs. Stone very clearly." Eliza said. Tell her I said so. Colton studied her for another moment. Something in his assessment recalibrated slightly, a minor adjustment like a rifleman adjusting for wind. He turned his horse without another word and rode out through the gate, his 3 men following. She watched them go until the sound of hooves was gone. Then she went inside, locked the door, checked the windows, and sat down at the kitchen table with the revolver in front of her and her hands folded over each other on the table. She sat there until midnight, not sleeping, not quite wake in the full sense either. Somewhere in the particular alertness of someone who is committed to remaining present, regardless of the cost. At midnight, the fence line began to burn, not the whole fence. 3 specific points along the eastern perimeter, 3 fires starting within minutes of each other in the darkness, which meant 3 people with 3 sources of flame positioned and waiting for a signal. Not opportunistic, coordinated. She saw the glow from the kitchen window. She was out the door and running before she fully processed what she was looking at. She fought the fires with water from the rain barrel and wet burlap from the barn, moving between the 3 points with the tunnel-focused urgency of someone who understands that fire does not negotiate and time is the only currency that matters in this transaction. The grass around 2 of the fires was dry enough that she lost those fence sections, entirely 12 feet of rails, and posts reduced to glowing char. The third she beat back before it spread beyond the fence itself. She stood in the dark with her hands blistered and her face heat-reddened and looked at what had been done to the east fence line of Callaway Ranch, and she felt something clarify inside her, not anger, not fear, something colder and more useful than either. At dawn, she surveyed the damage. 3 sections of fence destroyed. The message clear: we can burn what we choose and leave what we choose, and your ability to determine which of your things survives depends entirely on your willingness to cooperate. She went inside and wrote in her careful teacher's hand a detailed account of everything that had happened since her arrival in Millhaven. The delivery of sabotage supplies, the figure on the ridge, Colton's visit and his specific words, the fires and the evidence of their coordination. She dated it and signed it and put it in the inside pocket of her spare dress. Evidence if she needed it. She intended to need it. The morning passed in the particular way that mornings pass when you are waiting for something and cannot change the speed of its arrival. She repaired what could be repaired. She went through the barn methodically and found in a locked box she had to break open with a fence tool a second box of ammunition for the revolver, 36 additional rounds. She loaded the cylinder and put the rest in her dress pocket and felt the weight of them there was something that was not comfort exactly, but was in the same general neighborhood. Reed did not return by noon. She told herself this was not a problem. He had said tomorrow evening. It was still morning. He did not return by mid-afternoon. She began watching the road with the specific quality of watching that she recognized as the beginning of something she did not want to give a name to. At 3:30, there was movement at the front gate. Not Reed, not a single rider. 8 men. They came into the yard in a loose formation, the kind that is not organized enough to be military, but is organized enough to demonstrate intent. Colton was at the front, the same man from yesterday evening, but something in his posture was different now. The assessment was already complete. He had not come to negotiate. She was on the porch when they arrived. The document, he said without preamble, signed and sealed. Now. No, she said. He looked at her, then at the men arranged in a semicircle behind him. The calculation in his eyes was the calculation of a man who has done his arithmetic in advance and is satisfied with the results. Miss Ward, he said with a patient reasonableness that was the most frightening thing he had said yet, you are one woman with a sidearm. There are 8 of us. This doesn't end the way you seem to think it ends. 6 shots, she said. 8 of you. You're right that the math doesn't favor me. She raised the revolver, both hands, the way Reed had shown her, sights aligned, breathing out. But the first 2 of you through this gate are going to have a very specific problem, and everyone behind them is going to have about a second and a half to decide how much they're being paid is worth being the next person in line. The yard went quiet in the way that things go quiet when everyone in them is calculating simultaneously, and the calculations are not yet complete. 3 seconds. 5. Colton moved his horse to the side, not retreating, repositioning, and she tracked him with the barrel because she understood that he was trying to find an angle that made her choice harder, and she was not going to let him. She fired. not at Colton, into the post beside him close enough that the wood exploded 2 inches from his right knee. That was to demonstrate that I know how, she said, her voice level and uninflected, the voice she had used in the schoolroom for 8 years when she needed 30 children to understand that she meant precisely what she had said. 5 shots left. The yard held for exactly 4 seconds, which is a very long time when you are standing on a porch with a revolver and 8 men in front of you. Then from the back of the group, one of the men turned his horse and started for the gate. Then a second. Colton looked at his departing men with the expression of someone watching a mathematical certainty become a human variable, which is the most frustrating thing that can happen to a careful plan. He looked at her. Something in his face was different from yesterday. Yesterday he had been assessing. Today he was revising. "This isn't over," he said. "I know," she said. "Go." He went. She stood on the porch and watched until they were completely gone. All 8 horses, all 8 men, the sound of hooves fading into the open air of Wyoming territory. Then she sat down on the porch step because her legs had decided that continuing to bear her weight at full extension was no longer among the services they were prepared to provide. Her hands were shaking. She had not let them shake while the men were there, had kept them steady by the same effort she had used to keep everything steady since Boston, the accumulated practice of not giving whatever was inside her the satisfaction of visible expression. Now alone on the porch with the empty yard in front of her and the afternoon light going long across the grass, she let them shake, just for a moment, just until the worst of it had moved through and passed the way weather passes. She reloaded, counted the remaining rounds in her pocket, went inside and checked every window and door, made coffee, which was terrible but was hot, sat down at the table, waited. The light changed. Late afternoon became early evening, the particular golden thickening of September light in open country. She watched it move across the kitchen floor and thought about Reed on the road somewhere between here and Millhaven, and about James Foster somewhere in the territory with a warrant and a lifetime's worth of unanswered questions, and about Harriet Stone in her bank office in town, revising her timeline again, trying to determine what variable had produced a woman who would stand on a porch and put a shot 2 inches from a hired man's knee rather than sign a document. She thought about Daniel Foster's journal, wherever Reed had it, and what was written in it, and what it would mean to the man who had spent 5 years trying to understand what had actually happened to his brother on a night outside Laramie. She did not hear the horses until they were almost at the gate, 2 of them moving fast, the particular rhythm of horses that have been ridden hard and are nearly home. She was on the porch with the revolver before she heard the gate. Then Reed came through it on the dun horse, pressed low over the neck, moving like a man who has been told something urgent and has ridden accordingly. And beside him on a gray mare she did not recognize, a woman, straight-backed, riding with the competence of someone who learned early and has not stopped since, her hair pinned under a plain hat, her coat dark and practical. They pulled up at the porch and Reed was off his horse before it fully stopped. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No." She lowered the revolver. "They came, 8 of them. Colton." She looked at him. "I discouraged them." He took this in. His jaw shifted once. He looked at the damaged fence line along the eastern perimeter, visible even in the fading light. "They burned the fence last night," she said. 3 points, coordinated. The woman on the gray mare dismounted with the unhurried efficiency of someone who has reached a destination and is now ready to work. She was perhaps 45, with a face that had been given good bones and had spent a long time putting them to use in rooms where other people's claims required direct and occasionally uncomfortable challenge. She pulled her saddlebag down and looked at Eliza with an assessing directness that was somehow the opposite of threatening. "You're Eliza Ward," she said. "Yes." "Catherine Wells. I practice law in Cheyenne." She looked at the yard, the fence line, the boards on the lower windows. "Reed told me what's been happening. I've been watching Harriet Stone's activities in this territory for 8 months. I had my own reasons for coming." She set her saddlebag on the porch rail and opened it. "And now I'd like to hear everything that has happened to you since you arrived, in exactly the order it happened, with as much detail as you can give me." "I've already wrote it down," Eliza said. Catherine Wells looked at her, and something in the assessment behind her eyes arrived at a conclusion. "Good. Start from the beginning anyway. I want to hear it in your own voice." She produced a notebook and a pen. "Every word matters. Every word is ammunition." She sat down at the porch table and opened the notebook and looked at Eliza with the focused, forward-leaning attention of someone who has made a career out of listening to things other people have not been interested enough to hear. Reed unsaddled both horses and led them to the water trough, moving through the evening chores with the quiet efficiency of a man who understands that the practical things do not stop requiring attention because the large things have arrived. The stars came out over Wyoming territory as Eliza Ward began to tell her story, again this time, to a woman who wrote everything down and missed nothing, and the night settled around the ranch with the particular quality of a thing that is preparing quietly for what comes next. By the time Catherine closed her notebook that first night, the lamp had burned low and the coffee had gone cold. She had what she needed: 3 hours of testimony, every incident dated and sequenced, the fraudulent ink identified and documented in Eliza's own handwriting before anyone had told her it mattered. Reed sat at the far end of the table until the end, saying nothing, listening to the shape of what was being built around him. When Catherine finally stood and said she needed to be at the Millhaven courthouse before the bank opened, the look she gave Eliza on her way out of the kitchen was the look of a woman who does not give approval freely and had just given it. Reed stayed at the table after she left. Eliza sat across from him. "She's right," she said after a while. "I know. About the journal, too, you need to give it to James Foster before the trial, not after. If it comes out during the proceedings that you've been holding it, it muddies the water. But if Foster has already seen it and made his decision based on it, and if he appears as a witness who withdrew the warrant, that changes what the courtroom looks like." Reed looked at his coffee. The lamp on the table between them moved in some draft she couldn't locate. His face in the moving light was the face of a man reviewing a series of decisions he had made over a long period of time and trying to determine which of them had been mistakes and which had simply been expensive. "The journal is in the barn," he said, "in the floor. There's a loose board under the feed bin." "I know where it is," she said. He looked at her. "I didn't disturb it, but I found the board. I looked to see if it was structural or deliberate, and it was deliberate, and I left it." She met his eyes. "It's your decision, Reed. It was always your decision. I can tell you what I think will happen if you give it to him. I cannot tell you what you'll carry if you don't." He was quiet for a long time. The lamp flickered. Outside, Wyoming was doing what Wyoming does at night, which is to say it was being enormous and dark and entirely indifferent to the specific concerns of the people who have built their small structures on its surface. "Grace would have told me to give it immediately," he said. "The night I brought it home, she would have sat me down at this table and said, 'You cannot solve a wound by keeping it inside you.'" "She sounds like she knew some things," Eliza said. "She knew most things," he said simply and without qualification. "The important ones, anyway." He stood, went to the door, opened it, and stood in the doorway for a moment with the Wyoming night behind him, the stars over his shoulder, the dark shape of the land going out in every direction. "Good night, Eliza," he said. She noticed that he used her name. He had used her name before, certainly in the administrative sense of reference. This was different. It was the name as itself, not as a label, but as a recognition. The specific word that refers to the specific person. "Good night," she said. She went back to her cabin. She lay down without the revolver for the first time since she had arrived, setting it on the table rather than holding it in her hand, and thought about how quickly certain things become normal and how quickly others refuse to. She was asleep in 10 minutes. She did not hear anything from the main house. 2 weeks passed. James Foster returned on a Tuesday afternoon, riding alone out of the north, no escort, no announcement. He pulled up at the front gate and waited, which was itself a form of message. He was not coming in uninvited. He would wait until he was invited. Reed saw him from the yard and walked to the gate and opened it, and James Foster rode through and dismounted, and they stood in the yard with the September afternoon around them and the distance between them that had been established over 5 years of pursuit and evasion, which turns out to be a very particular kind of distance, neither close nor far a distance, that has its own specific gravity. Reed had given him the journal 6 days earlier. He had gone to Foster's camp north of town alone in the early morning with the journal wrapped in its oilcloth in his saddlebag. He had placed it on the camp table and said nothing except, "Read it, and then decide whatever you're going to decide, and I'll accept it either way." And he had ridden home. James Foster had not come back for 6 days. 6 days during which Eliza had watched the North Ridge every morning with her coffee and said nothing about what she was watching for. Now he was here. 3 handwriting experts, James said, standing in the yard. His voice had something different in it, not softer exactly, but less compressed, like something that had been held at pressure for a long time had found a small release. Independent, all 3 confirmed the writing is Daniel's. The dates, the names, the account numbers he referenced. I had them verified separately. Reed said nothing. Bill Tanner. James stopped. His jaw moved once. He was my friend from before the war. He worked the payroll run every month for 12 years, had 3 daughters. He looked at the ground between them. I stood at his grave and I could not tell his wife what happened because I did not know. And then I read what Daniel wrote about the schedule he gave them and the exact time the vault would be open. And I understood what happened to Bill Tanner and why, and I understood it because my brother wrote it down. The yard held the silence. There was a second document in the journal, James said. A letter, folded into the back cover, addressed to whoever shot him if that person ever found the journal. He reached into his coat, not with the careful demonstration of earlier, but with the direct, unself-conscious motion of someone passing along something that needs to be passed along. He held out an envelope. Reed looked at it. He knew you were coming, James said. He wrote that he had been watching you track the gang for 2 months. He knew your methods. He knew when you found him, it would be in a situation where he could not surrender without being taken alive, and he knew what being taken alive would cost. A pause. He wrote that he chose the angle of the confrontation deliberately, that you acted in good faith with the information you had. James's voice stayed level, but the level required visible effort to maintain. He wrote that he was sorry, not for dying, for everything before it. Reed took the envelope. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at James Foster. I'll read it alone, he said. Yes, James said. Of course, Rero. Reed walked to the barn. The door closed behind him. Eliza came out of the house where she had been on the porch and had heard enough of the conversation to understand its shape. She looked at James Foster, who was standing in the yard with the particular posture of a man who has just set something down that he has been carrying for a very long time and is not yet certain what to do with hands that are suddenly empty. Coffee, she said. He looked at her. Thank you. They sat on the porch. She brought 2 cups of what she had with experience and patience, improved significantly since her first encounter with Reed's approach to coffee, which had been aggressive and inaccurate. They sat and drank and looked out at the yard, and neither of them spoke for a while, which was fine. Some silences are not voids that require filling, but spaces that are themselves doing necessary work. My brother was not a good man, James Foster said eventually. By the end, I don't think he started that way. I think he made a series of choices and each one made the next easier, the way a slope gets steeper the longer you travel it without stopping. He held his cup in both hands. I needed to know if Calloway killed him or if Daniel chose it, and now I know. Does it help, she asked. He considered this honestly. It changes what I've been carrying. Whether that's help, I'll have to wait and see. From inside the barn, there was nothing audible. No sound she could identify. Just the closed-door quiet of a private thing. It was nearly 20 minutes before Reed came out. He walked from the barn to the yard with a particular gait of a man who is covering ground without being entirely present in the covering of it. He stopped at the porch steps. His eyes were dry, but there was something about the whole of his face that was different, as though the internal arrangement of whatever had been behind it had shifted some load-bearing element, moved to a different position. He looked at James Foster. He said to tell you he was glad you had something worth doing, Reed said. The looking, he said it was the right use for a man like you. James Foster absorbed this without any particular visible response, which was itself a response. He set his cup down, stood. I'm withdrawing the warrant, he said. I'll file the paperwork in Denver this week. The matter is closed. He walked to his horse, mounted. He looked at Reed from the saddle, and Reed looked back at him, and between them was 5 years, and a dead man, and a folded letter, and something that was not forgiveness and was not its absence, but was something in a different category from either one, a kind of mutual acknowledgement that certain things happened and cost what they cost, and that the people who paid the car are still standing. Good luck to you, Calloway, James Foster said. And to you, Reed said. He rode north, The hooves found their rhythm on the packed earth of the road, and then the sound of them faded, and the land absorbed them the way it absorbs everything eventually without comment. Eliza stood at the porch rail and watched the road after he was gone. Reed stood in the yard below her. Neither of them spoke for a while. "You cried," she said finally, "not as an accusation, as an observation offered neutrally the way you name weather. In the barn." He looked at the barn door as though he could see back through it to whatever had happened there. "There's a thing in the letter I'll tell you someday. Not today." "All right," she said. "All right," he agreed. They went inside and had a meal that was better than most of the meals that had preceded it and did not talk about anything important and were in the particular way of people who have been through something together and are letting the after of it settle entirely comfortable with one another. The trial of Harriet Stone before the Millhaven District Court on the 12th of November, 1884, was attended by every person in Millhaven who had legs and curiosity, which was functionally every person in Millhaven. The courtroom above the main street had been designed to hold 40 people. By 8 in the morning, when the doors opened, there were 60 in the room and 20 more in the hallway outside it and another 30 in the street below the windows. The citizens of Millhaven had lived for years with the particular unease of a community that knows something is wrong in it and has not yet found the correct way to address the wrongness. And they had arrived this morning with the energy of people for whom something long deferred is finally at last being addressed. Harriet Stone sat at the defendant's table with her attorney, a man brought in from Laramie, whose face had the expression of someone who has reviewed the available facts and has decided that his role here is primarily dignified endurance rather than genuine advocacy. She sat with her spine straight and her hands folded on the table and her face arranged in the expression she had been wearing for 30 years in rooms that required her to appear to be the most composed person present. Her hands did not shake. Eliza noted this as she took her seat in the witness gallery and understood that Harriet Stone was a woman of considerable discipline, whatever else she was. Judge Alderman brought from Cheyenne because the local judge had recused himself on grounds of prior dealings with the bank was a lean man of 60 with white eyebrows in the courtroom manner of someone who has presided over a great many human disasters and has arrived at a kind of settled respect for the process regardless of the content passing through it. Catherine Wells stood when he took his seat and did not wait for pleasantries. She placed 2 documents on the evidence table, side by side so anyone who looked could see them without instruction. "The first document," she said to Judge Alderman, "is the water rights claim filed by Harriet Stone on behalf of the Millhaven Commercial Bank, alleging that a loan held by the late Silas Crawford was secured by the water rights of the Callaway Ranch aquifer. The second document is a certified analysis from 3 independent chemists in Denver and Cheyenne, examining the ink composition of the relevant clause in that first document." She let the judge read. "The loan document was signed in 1881, she continued. "The water rights clause was written in an ink formulation that was not commercially available until 1883. The clause was not present when the document was originally executed. It was added after the fact in a different ink by a different hand after Silas Crawford was no longer alive to confirm or deny its existence." The room was very quiet. "This is not an irregularity," Catherine said. "This is fraud. Deliberate, documented, and in this case part of a demonstrable pattern that includes the destruction of the Harding family's barn in February of 1881 and the systematic disappearance of the Colburn family's cattle over a 3-week period in the spring of 1882. All of these events preceded property transfers that benefited the defendant. None of them were accidents." Harriet Stone's attorney said something in a low voice. She listened without turning her head. Then she shook it very slightly once. Jacob Colton testified. He did so with the careful, specific, deliberately limited contrition of a man who has made an agreement and intends to honor its exact terms without volunteering anything beyond them. He confirmed the instructions he had received. He confirmed the fence fires. He confirmed the delivery of the sabotage supplies. He did not look at Harriet Stone while he spoke, which was itself an eloquent statement about the nature of their professional relationship. Amos Fletcher testified. He described the platform encounter in the technical language of contracts and transfers, and in doing so inadvertently painted a picture of Harriet Stone's presence at the station and the nature of her interest in Eliza's contract that was in the specific context of everything else being presented deeply clarifying. Then Catherine looked at Eliza. Miss Ward, she walked to the witness stand in the black wedding dress. She had considered in the days before the trial wearing something different. She had decided against it. The dress was part of the record. It was there on the platform the day this began. It would be there today. She felt Harriet Stone look at her as she passed the defendant's table. She did not look back. She walked to the stand and sat down and faced the courtroom. She was not nervous. She had expected to be nervous and was not, which she found interesting in the way that unexpected things about yourself are always interesting. She was clear. She was focused. She realized exactly as prepared for this room as she was for any room in which she had stood and required 40 people to pay attention to what she was saying. She was a teacher. This was in its essential structure teaching. Catherine walked her through it. The platform, the contract, Reed's offer, and the terms of the partnership agreement, the delivery of sabotage supplies, the rider on the ridge, Colton's visit and his specific language, the fence fires, the night of 8 men. She described the night of 8 men precisely and without dramatic elaboration, because precise and unelaborated truth has a weight that dramatic elaboration cannot match and generally only diminishes. She described the firing, the sequence, the numbers, the moment when Colton pressed the revolver to her head. The courtroom was silent in a way that was not the absence of sound, but the presence of 50 people holding their breath simultaneously. She described the sound of hoofbeats from the road and Reed coming through the gate and Catherine Wells beside him and the men fleeing, and then she stopped because that was where the events of that particular night concluded. Catherine said, "Thank you, Miss Ward." She stood to go back to her seat. She stopped, turned. Harriet Stone was looking at her. For the first time since the platform, Harriet Stone was looking at her directly, without the protective mask of the no or the glancing assessment, but straight on with the full attention of a very intelligent woman who has spent her life arranging things to her advantage and has arrived at a point where the arrangements are no longer functioning as designed. Eliza looked back. She did not feel the thing she had expected to feel, which was something sharp and satisfying. She felt instead something quieter, a recognition not of kinship, but of the particular sadness of seeing what a person has made of themselves when they had the capacity to make something entirely different. She went back to her seat. Judge Alderman took 40 minutes. He returned from his chambers with the look of a man who has done what was required of him and is neither satisfied nor dissatisfied, because satisfaction and dissatisfaction are responses to outcomes. And what he had produced was not an outcome, but the beginning of consequences, which is a different thing. Fraud, arson, conspiracy to commit assault, attempted murder, the water rights claim voided in its entirety, restitution ordered to the Harding family and the Colburn family from the assets of the bank, $5,000 in damages to Callaway Ranch, not less than 10 years in the territorial prison. He set his gavel down with a sound that was not loud, but that carried to every corner of the room and through the open windows to the street below, where people were waiting to hear it. Harriet Stone stood when the sentence was read. She stood as straight as she had sat, which was something Eliza found herself noting, without quite knowing why, the specific quality of a person who refuses to collapse even at the moment when collapsing would be the most understandable thing available to them. 2 deputies came to either side of her. She looked at Eliza as they moved her toward the door. Her face was perfectly composed. The expression on it was not defeat exactly and not defiance. It was something more complicated than either the expression of a person who has been playing a long game and has for the first time encountered a board on which the game is no longer winnable and is making the specific kind of internal adjustment that only very determined people are capable of making. She did not say anything. She walked out with her spine straight and her hands steady, and the door closed behind her and the room exhaled all at once. The evening after the trial, Reed Callaway placed a piece of paper on the kitchen table. Not the partnership agreement he had written on the wagon to the ranch. A new one different in specific ways from the first. Eliza sat down across from him and picked it up and read it. It was a deed, not a promise of a deed to come. An actual deed notarized transferring full and equal ownership of Callaway Ranch to 2 named parties, Reed Thomas Callaway and Eliza May Ward. Equal shares, equal voting rights in all decisions affecting the property. Co-ownership, not employment, not tenancy, not arrangement, Partnership in the legal and binding sense of the word. At the bottom in handwriting, she recognized, now as his, a note in smaller letters beneath the formal language of the document, if you are willing. Not because the original contract requires it, not because you have earned it through service, because you have been here less than 2 months, and this place is already different because of you, and I am already different because of you, and I would like if you are willing to build something here that belongs to both of us in every sense that matters. She read it twice. She set it down. She looked at him across the table, this man who had paid $900 for a stranger on a platform and handed her a key and a gun and a cabin with a locked door and then gotten out of the way while she did what she did, this man who had wept alone in the upstairs room of his own house for 6 years and had somewhere in the past 2 months stopped doing that. "You're certain," she said. "I've been certain since the fence fire." His voice was level, the usual level, but underneath it was something she had learned to recognize over the past weeks, a warmth that expressed itself not as warmth, but as a kind of additional steadiness, as though she was one of the things he was steady for. "I watched you put out 3 fires by yourself in the middle of the night and come back inside and make a written record of it and go back to sleep. I knew then." "That's a strange basis for a business partnership," she said. "It's an accurate one." She thought about the contract her father had written, the one in the oilcloth at the bottom of her bag, which she had not touched since she arrived. She thought about the platform and Fletcher and the particular quality of 40 pairs of eyes assessing her value. She thought about what it means to sign your name to something because you choose to, rather than because someone has arranged the circumstances so that choosing otherwise is impossible. She picked up the pen. She signed. Reed signed. The kitchen was quiet around them. The lamp between them on the table burned with the steadiness that good oil and a clean wick produce, without drama, without fluctuation, just a clear and consistent light that made everything within its reach visible. She put the pen down. He picked up the deed and looked at both signatures on it for a moment. Then he folded it and set it beside his coffee cup and looked at her. "There's something I should have done years ago," he said. "I'd like to do it tomorrow morning, if you are willing to help." She looked at him. "Grace wanted roses," he said, "by the east corner of the house where the sun comes first in the morning. She said every house needs something beautiful growing beside it. I told her I'd plant them when the season was right. Then the season was always wrong, and then she was gone, and I did not plant them because I did not know how to do it without her there, and eventually not planting them became a form of grief I did not know how to stop." He looked at the table. "I ordered a cutting from the catalog 2 weeks ago. It arrived yesterday. It's in the barn." He looked up. "I think it's time to plant it." She thought about the cedar trunk in the storage room, about the photograph on the mantel, and the quality of warmth that had been preserved in silver and paper for 6 years in this house, about the small grave with no body under it in the far corner of the property, and what it had cost a man to put it there and look at it every morning. "Yes," she said, "I'd like to help with that." In the morning, Reed brought the cutting from the barn. It was small, wrapped in damp burlap, a few inches of cane with the promise of roots beginning at the base. The variety was a climber pale pink when it bloomed, bred for cold climates designed to survive winters that would kill less determined things. They knelt together at the east corner of the house in the October morning, which was cold enough to see their breath, but warm enough in the direct sunlight to work with comfort. The ground there was good, deep, and workable, fed by the same aquifer that Harriet Stone had spent months trying to steal. Reed dug with a trowel, carefully making the hole the right depth and width, the way a man does a thing he has been thinking about how to do for a long time. Eliza held the cutting and watched the process, and then she placed the roots into the prepared earth with both hands holding the cane upright while he pushed the soil back around it and firmed it with his palms. She held it steady while he worked. The cane was thin, not much to look at, the way most things that are going to become something considerable look initially like nothing very special. "Will it take," she asked, "if we give it what it needs?" He smoothed the last of the soil and sat back on his heels looking at the cutting. "It'll need protecting through the first winter. After that, it'll manage itself. These roses are stubborn things. They don't give up easily." He looked at her when he said it with the particular quality of regard she had come to recognize over the past weeks, the one that said something more than what the words said, the one she had not yet decided fully how to receive, but which she was no longer finding reasons to look away from. Like someone I know, he said. She did not answer this, but she did not look away from it either, which was itself a kind of answer. They stood. He went to the well for water and carried it back and poured it slowly around the base of the cutting, not flooding it, giving the soil time to receive what was being offered. She stood at the corner of the house and watched him work and thought about the many ways that things which have been dormant for a long time return to life when the conditions change around them. That evening she stood on the porch alone. Reed was in the barn doing the last of the day's work, the particular rhythm of end-of-day tasks that a ranch requires regardless of what else has happened, the feeding and checking and securing, that does not defer to the emotional significance of the day preceding it. The sky over Wyoming territory in October is something you have to be under to understand. The stars come out before the light is fully gone. First one, then a handful, then what appears to be the entire inventory of all the stars that have ever existed spread across the black in the particular profusion that is only possible at this altitude and this distance from any city's interference. The Milky Way comes up like a river over the eastern ridge and runs all the way to the western horizon, an argument for scale that requires no words to make. She stood under it in the cold air and thought about the black wedding dress hanging on the hook inside her door. She thought about the morning she had put it on for the last time before the trial. The way it felt different now from the way it had felt when she stepped off the train, in it the same garment entirely, but carrying a different weight, a different history. Her father had bought it to send her off as property. She had turned it into something else in the wearing of it, something that belonged to the story she had made rather than the story he had written. She was not going to stop wearing it. Not yet. Not because she had no alternative, but because it had become hers in a way that things become yours when you have taken them from the purposes others assigned to them and made them serve your own. She thought of the day which she did not know yet when it would be, but was certain of, as she was of anything, when the rose at the east corner of the house would bloom for the first time. That morning she would find something else to wear, something with color in it. Until then the black dress remained what it had become, which was a record of a journey from one condition to another, and she was not ready to set the record down. The barn door opened, and Reed came across the yard in the dark, moving by the familiarity of a man on ground he has crossed 10,000 times. He came to the porch and stood on the step below hers, which put them at the same height, which she did not think was accidental. He looked up at the same sky she had been looking at. "Cold front coming," he said. "Tomorrow night, maybe the night after. We'll need to put something over the cutting. I have burlap in the barn." A pause. "I'll do it in the morning." "We'll do it," she said. A brief silence. "We'll do it," he agreed. They stood in the cold and watched the stars turn through their slow, enormous arcs, the sky doing what it has always done, indifferent to the small and specific lives being lived below, it which somehow makes those lives feel not smaller, but more deliberate, more chosen, more worth the choosing. After a while, he said without any preamble or apparent connection to what had come before, "Thank you." She looked at him. "For the platform," he said. "I did a thing there that was half for you and half for me, and you knew which half was which, and you didn't hold the second half against me. And then you stayed." "I signed a contract," she said. "You could have left." She considered the full truth of this. She could have left. The circumstances that would have made leaving difficult were addressed early enough that they were never genuinely binding. She had stayed because she chose to, and they both knew that, and the knowing of it was present in every exchange they had had since the early days. "I stayed," she said, "because there was something here worth staying for." He did not ask her to elaborate on this, which she appreciated. The light in the upstairs window of the main house was not burning tonight, she noticed. Had not burned in the past week. The man who had wept alone in the dark of that room for 6 years had at some point in the past few weeks stopped needing to. She could not have said exactly when it happened, and she did not think he could either. Grief does not end at a specific moment. It changes shape. It takes up less of the available room. You begin to find that the space it was occupying has become available for other uses. He went inside. She heard his footsteps on the stairs, the particular sound of the boards she had learned in the way you learn a house when you live in it, the third step from the top, the way the landing creaked slightly under weight. Then silence, and after the silence, the brief glow of the lamp in the upstairs window. She watched it burn for a moment. Then it went out, not extinguished suddenly the way a lamp goes out when the wick is turned down in anger or grief. Slowly, the way a lamp goes out when the oil is spent and the light has done what it came to do and can now rest. She stood on the porch in the Wyoming dark and breathed the cold, clean air of the high plains until her lungs ached with the pleasure of it, and then she went inside up to her room on the second floor of the house that was now half hers, closed the door that had a lock on it and a key that she kept, and lay down. Sleep came quickly, quietly. The way sleep comes to a person who has arrived after a long journey through difficult terrain at a place that the body has decided to accept as home, even if the mind is still negotiating the terms. Outside, the rose cutting stood in its prepared ground at the east corner of the house, dormant and unremarkable in the October dark, waiting for spring, the way determined things wait, unhurried, certain. Eliza Ward had stepped off a train in a black wedding dress with a carpet bag and a contract that called her property, and a father who had made her a line item in his debts. She had signed her name on a deed to 100 acres of Wyoming land. She had stood on a porch with a revolver and 8 men in front of her and held her ground. She had come here in the dark. She was building something in the light. And the dress that her father had bought to bury her in had become in the wearing of it through fire and testimony and the cold mornings of an honest beginning entirely and irrevocably her own.